You're listening to the Integrated Business Planning Podcast, where we share stories of business transformation with your host, Lance Tyler, founder and CEO of ActionKPI.
Morning, Martin. Thank you for joining the podcast. Really excited to have you and very excited about the topic we're going to be discussing. But first and foremost, just wanted to, get to know Martin, what your title is, what your current role, and then I've always got a nice question around, how do you start your day? What's your morning routine? So.
All right. So I have many titles. So we'll go with we'll start with the business ones, and not the personal ones. So I'm an accountant by training, but actually my current role, I'm the president of a boutique management consultancy company. Boutique meaning we're small. All right, that's one of those phrases that management consultants come up with, and we're focused on resolving issues for clients who are in demanding commercial situations. So they've encountered a problem, they can't fix it internally, and they'll come to us for help, either with operational issues. I work with a bunch of Lean Six Sigma experts. So we're often fixing operational issues, profitability issues, product selection, but then also nice things that are nice for me, which are more around the finance, HR, training kind of things. So, if your operational issue is actually you got the wrong people in the wrong place, we'll try and fix that as well. So that's the day job. And then I'm also on the board of a few not-for-profits. And I think no surprise, one of them is my accounting institute, the local branch. So the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants here in Toronto is the sort of HQ for the Canadian branch. And I'm a special advisor to the board, having been a chair in the past. And then I'm also on the board of directors for a couple of cricket organizations that we organize. And then probably most relevant for a business podcast, I'm on the board of directors for the British Canadian Chamber of Trade and Commerce. So I hope at some point we'll bring all those things together. We'll talk cricket and accounting as a transatlantic
Talk about
business.
cricket and accounting. I mean, that's why we're here.
Yeah.
So just to start off, how do you start? What's your morning routine?
Well, it varies quite a lot, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later. When I was working on an M&A deal in Paris, it was mostly eating everything that I could find in Paris. Croissants, dairy, charcuterie, and I just had a fantastic time. Always eat a good breakfast. I mean, that's the only thing I sort of insist on. But because of those not-for-profit things I do, I'm often starting the day differently, because I'll have like a breakfast meeting for one organization. For the British Chamber of Commerce, we often have events that we're doing jointly with folks out of the UK. So because of the 5-hour time difference, I might be starting at 7 o'clock with a webinar. So it's always a bit chaotic, and not normally like this morning. My wife couldn't find her earbuds, so we spent the pre-dawn hours looking under the beds and checking out behind cupboards, trying to find earbuds, because she sits on a subway train for an hour.
Yes.
Each day when she goes to work. So having her earbuds is essential to her start of the day. And so it's before dawn, on my hands and knees, looking under the bed for a little white earbud was not what I had planned for today. So there you go.
It's funny. I do the same thing with my son, and it's almost that's not every morning, but it's a lot of mornings. It absolutely is.
Yeah. I'm always impressed by what parents manage to do, because having been the youngest of 4, and my oldest brother is 11 years older than me, every day was a range of chaos for my parents, because my oldest brother, when he got into his late teens, was a skinhead, which wasn't much fun for my dad, who was himself in the Navy, and his dad was in the Navy. So to have this guy in the house who was uh, quite the rebel was very challenging for my dad. And then my two other brothers were doing their own thing, and then there was me, 11 years younger, still needing help putting on my clothes. And there's my brother causing chaos around the house. So kudos to all the parents out there who managed to keep it together and still turn up for work.
Yeah, I got 4 kids, and I laugh about that chaos actually, because it does happen. It's a mad rush before they get on the bus. So, but yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe talking more, maybe a bit about your career, a bit about your background, and then there's a really interesting topic I think around mergers and acquisitions and the kind of post integration, and just all the impacts from people, process, technology. So we're definitely going to lead up to that, but maybe let's start with a bit of your background, Martin. Where's your career kind of got you to running this boutique management consultancy?
Yeah. So when I was at university, I actually studied history, and loved history very much. Focused on that, and my mum sat me down at some point and pointed out that no one makes money from reading history books. That I either had to be the best historian in the country, which was not going to happen, or I had to sort of settle down and get a proper career. So I was also interested in numbers, so I joined KPMG as a trainee accountant, and I have to say, brilliant, absolutely brilliant business training. Which is what it was advertised as, perhaps more than just becoming an accountant. It was advertised as a business training. And I think, in the first sort of 4 or 5 years that I was at KPMG, I probably saw 20 different businesses each year. Right. And you get to look under the hood. You get to ask very personal questions. You get to poke around in the numbers. Going into the warehouse, contacting customers, a lot of great stuff. And I think that really set me up well. And we covered everybody from Oxford University, Surrey County Council, Siemens, the German industrial business, small companies, big companies, manufacturers, services, everything. Really good training. But did make me realize I didn't want to become a CA. Being a specialist financial reporting accountant was really not where I wanted to go. So I left KPMG and joined British Alcan. So Alcan doesn't sort of exist anymore except as a name on certain products. But Alcan was a Canadian aluminum giant. And in the 80s, I think they'd taken over a British company called British Aluminium Company. And I think at that point, there was probably 6,000 employees in the UK. By the time I joined, they were down to 3,000 employees. And then by the time I relocated to Canada, I think we were down under 1,000. It was really shrinking in the UK. But the company was growing, and it was growing internationally. They bought out a Swiss company, and as a result of working on that acquisition, I got to work in Montreal for a few years, and then a few years turned into 20 years. And in that space of time, we bought a French company. We sold off some American businesses. We got bought out by an Anglo-Australian company, and then I didn't like them, so I left and set up my own business. And as happens with these things, my first client was the Anglo-Australian company I didn't like. But when you set up on your own, you have to do what you know and work with the people and those are the people I knew. So
Absolutely, and that must have been really interesting. Like the exposure, I think, just starting the foundation of KPMG, seeing all those businesses and how they operate, from a financial lens. And then, obviously the mergers and acquisitions, or what you got involved in, I guess, through Alcan, was must have been obviously the passion of it, where you really found a lot of enjoyment, I presume, to go off and do it on your own, or maybe part of that. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's all problem solving, right? I love
Mhm.
problem solving. I love analyzing things. One of the things that I do feel I benefit from having studied history is there's a lot of analysis in history, right? You're reading documents and trying to work out, is this document helpful or not? Like, is this just propaganda or is it a real timeline of events? Um, and you're taking in a range of documents. So, like, if you look at Shakespeare's history plays, they're not good history, right? They're not an accurate portrayal of the events at that time, but they're an interesting historical document because it's an insight into how people in the late 16th, early 17th century saw the history of England, saw the history of Europe. So you can bring those documents in to tell you about what was happening in England in 1605. And so you bring in these different documents, and it's the same in business, right? You're bringing in different bits of intelligence, bits of data. You're looking at market reports, you're looking at your competitors' financial statements. You're looking at a range of things to try and find out like what's going on out there, so you can then address your customers' needs. So that was really useful. Doing the auditing, as I say, brilliant because you just see 100 different ways to run a business, and you pay $100,000 to Rotman to get that education, or you can do it while someone pays you. So um, that was great, and like I say, a range of companies. I remember there was a warehousing business which was in trouble, and the CEO got fired, and the new CEO explained to me warehousing, and it was amazing because you're getting a lesson in business from the CEO of a business who's telling me I was asking the wrong questions about the audit, and these are the questions I should be asking. So that was great, really great experience. The M&A stuff, again, really brilliant because it's all problem solving.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what I enjoy still with my clients is problem solving, whatever that problem happens to be.
And again, we're probably just talking about the mergers acquisitions. I mean, before the podcast, we talked, what you saw in terms of, success. I think you've been through a couple mergers and acquisitions, and there you talked about three, but one of them stood out as being the most successful. Maybe we can kind of walk through, or maybe you can elaborate on, how you found success, kind of that post integration from these mergers. Maybe some lessons learned that you could educate the rest of the folks on who are listening.
Yeah. So the first one I was involved in was that Swiss acquisition I mentioned earlier, and I wouldn't say it was an accident, but it was not what management had planned. So there was supposed to be a three-way merger between Alcan, Alice Swiss, and Péchenet, which is a French company. And there were various sort of stumbling blocks along the way. The merger didn't happen. It was all very expensive, public failure. And we ended up buying Alice Swiss on its own. And it was presented as a merger, but really was an acquisition. But it wasn't what people had planned for. And so when it happened, there was no real plan to put in place. That wasn't really the deal they wanted. So the expectations that they had for it were wrong because it was the wrong deal that they did. And before we really even got into the integration process, our CEO resigned to spend more time with his family. And that sort of that wonderful euphemism of when you've really screwed up, and they go, "Oh, this guy's decided he likes his family after all, and he's gonna spend a lot of time there." So that was a real eye opener because I'd not really been involved in anything at that level before, and I got sent to Zurich in Switzerland because no one else would go. I'd love to think it's because I was brilliant, But actually, some people had started working on it and decided they didn't like it. Either it was too far away, or because it was uh, a lot of German language, or because they realized it wasn't the great acquisition that they thought, and they didn't want to be associated with a failure. Whereas I thought, wow, I get to spend some time in Switzerland. This sounds good. And I was genuinely the limit of my strategic thinking on that one.
Yeah.
There's good chocolate and nice mountains, and you're in the center of Europe, so this is great. But whilst I was there, I had this sort of education in like what M&A should really look like. I worked with a bunch of people who are trying to run the integration without really the buy-in from senior leadership. We kind of got, it wasn't a terrible deal, but we didn't get a good deal. And the guy who had sold the business, some people may remember, was an Italian Canadian called Sergio Marchioni, who went on to run Fiat. And Sergio was brilliant.
I remember reading about him.
Yeah. Sadly died way too young. But Sergio was a brilliant businessman, and he, totally outplayed us on this one. So it got me involved in this sort of executive level work that I had not imagined before. I was really just doing accounting, everything from double entry bookkeeping to VAT returns, right? Nothing particularly exciting. And then I had this exciting experience. And then because I had that experience in Zurich, they asked me to move to Montreal, which was where the head office of Alcam was, to continue that work. Because the CEO having left, we got a new CEO who's changing the culture of the business completely. He changed, I think, pretty much everybody in the C-suite got changed within 12 months.
You're going to change the culture, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and some of it was hiring people internally, some of it was external, but it was a real point where he said, I'm going to be changing this company. Are you along for the ride? And some people weren't. So
go back to Switzerland and go to another.
Yeah. So a lot of changes. And so one of the first things the new CFO, when he came in, he turned around to the group that I was in the finance department, the budget and analysis department, and said, right, how are we doing on our synergies? And we're like, what are you talking about? We weren't monitoring that at all.
Value, right? That's the number that creates value for.
That's the number that creates value, and he was a CFO who was focused on creating value for shareholders. The CEO had a value maximization mindset, and they came in and said, "Right, how are we doing on the synergies?" And we're like, "I don't know. Is someone supposed to look at that?" and it gives you, I think, an insight into how poorly prepared that acquisition was. Because basically you tell the shareholders, hey, give us billions of dollars, we're going to go and invest it in buying this company because it's going to make you money. And we'd made the promise and then didn't do anything to monitor the delivery of that return on investment. You wouldn't be allowed to do that. Like if you were buying, a new piece of equipment in a factory, you'd have to prepare the documents and say, yeah, we're going to be making this much more money. Then we'd be looking at your return and seeing if you actually made any more money. If you didn't make the money, you'd be fired. But we'd spent billions of dollars on this business and weren't monitoring the outcome. So we were supposed to we'd originally promised $180 million of synergies each year. And I don't think after the acquisition, anyone opened this book to see it. I'm sure there was somebody somewhere. In fact, I know there was one guy, come to that later. But, at an executive level, they weren't even looking at this. So the new CFO said, right, let's have a look at this. He looked through the thing. He said, right, who's doing what on here? And, there's some mumbling. No one really took ownership of it. So we had meetings, everyone got allocated their part, and my department was given responsibility for monitoring the performance. And the way CEOs and CFOs are inclined to do, he said, well, 180 is a weird number. Let's make it 200. But we don't know if it's 200. There's no, as an
Ways to
accountant.
back into it though, right? I mean, I'm sure.
Well, this is it, right? Like, as an accountant, you love to build up your numbers. And this guy said, no, we're not building up. We're coming down from the top. You're going to make me $200 million extra every year. And so we had to, put in place a process to deliver this 200 million and to report on the 200 million and see if it was being achieved. And as I say, there was one guy in the packaging division at the time, Alistair Horton, who'd put together a reporting template for his group. And he was monitoring it. So we took that template, we fiddled around with it a bit, and we made that the corporate template. And we started monitoring performance and really driving value. And that was a sort of first hint of the change in the culture that our CEO, Travis Engen, and Jeff Mersey, our CFO, were going to introduce. And huge change. And the other thing that happened that year that was a real, I think, red flag for Travis was we killed 12 people at work. And he had come from outside of metals and mining. And in his previous jobs, he didn't kill anybody, right? And so when he get these reports saying, another person's been killed on the job, he was absolutely horrified and said, we've got to stop this. This can't go on. And some of the executives were like, well, that's what we do. Like, we're in metals and mining, people get crushed. Get used to it. And he said, right, now I know what I need to do. And also, like, who's going to be on site for all this other stuff that I want to do. And so he used health and safety, branded it environment, health and safety first, EHS first. And you had to call it EHS first to really change the culture and drive past all these crusty old people who didn't want to change. So it was sort of a combination of value maximization and this change in health and safety was like how he started to really transform the business. And very wisely, he realized, like, if you're not willing to change to save the life of a colleague, you're certainly not going to change to make, a few extra bucks for some anonymous shareholders, right? So introduce EHS first. And one of the things that they discovered when they looked into it, and there was a British guy who was in charge, a Welsh guy called Simon Ledichuk. When they looked into it, every single one of those deaths was avoidable. So when people had said, oh, we're in metals and mining, people die, it wasn't lightning or, a sudden heart attack because somebody had an underlying health problem. There was a guy who got strangled by his equipment. There was, I can't remember if it was all these 12 in this year, but I remember reading the report. There was one guy being bitten by a snake, but we knew this area had snakes in it.
Yeah.
And we had anti-venom, but we wouldn't give it to the employees. They had to get to the office to get the anti-venom. Why? Like, there's no, different kind of snake in the office. But, we didn't trust the employees with the anti-venom. So by the time he got the anti-venom, he died. The guy was strangled by his equipment. There was a guy crushed by equipment because there was no off switch. There was a guy who fell into a hole, and someone who was run over by a truck. All of these deaths were avoidable, but the culture had been, shit happens.
That's interesting. It's like you bring it back to again, large organizational change really starts with the culture and probably the belief. And it sounded like the way that you guys, or the way that the team shifted it, was through a focus on safety, and value creation was obviously there, but it sounded like safety became number one, and that just cascaded down. Yes.
There's also a I think a genuine belief. I imagine this is backed up by data, but I wouldn't be able to put my hands on it. But there was a genuine belief that if you can't get health and safety right, what are the chances you're getting quality right? Right. So if your customers want a certain product to a certain standard, if you can't do health and safety, so maintaining processes, maintaining equipment, maintaining a healthy environment amongst staff, what are the chances that you're actually focusing on anything that the customer wants? So even though health and safety isn't necessarily something the customer demands, although increasingly I think customers are wary of working with a company that kills its employees. At the time, it wasn't necessarily something the customer was prepared to pay a premium for, to work with a company that was safe. But actually, it turns out you don't need to pay a premium for safety, because you don't have to stop every few hours when somebody gets crushed and you need to bring in an ambulance, right? So although it isn't explicitly something a customer is paying for, it sort of is. But yeah, if you can't operate safely, the chances that you're operating at a good quality are pretty low. So I think that was part of the thinking as well. Like, if I'm going to make this big change around safety and you can't get on board with that, then you don't care about quality, you don't care about the customer, you don't care about anything that's truly valuable, and we're not going to create money. So he did this big change in culture. I'm not sure if there was a sort of a hangover from the original failed three-way merger, or if this was a sort of a renewed strategy. But in 2003, we finished the three-way merger with a hostile takeover of the French company called Pechenay, and no one had done a hostile takeover of a blue chip French company before. And we took over that company, but because we'd done this work now of preparing the company, when we took over Pechenay, we did a much better job than we had with Allosuisse, even though Allosuisse was smaller. And so we had this much better experience taking over Pechenay. We were prepared to make, executives were prepared to make really difficult decisions. So one of the hiccups in 2000 was that the competition authorities wanted us to sell off certain businesses, and people couldn't agree because they're like, well, we should sell their business, not our business. There was a very parochial kind of response to it. But when Travis was in charge and he changed the culture, it wasn't a we them kind of situation. This is now one new business, and we spun off a $6 billion business out of the bits and pieces the competition authority said we couldn't keep. Set up this new business, send it off, and set it up on its own, and people were really stunned because this had been apparently insurmountable in 2000, and it was fixed in 2004, 2005. We spun off this business, solved the problem, made a bunch of money for people, and it was all because the culture and the internal operation of the business had been fixed before trying the M&A deal.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a standard sort of aphorism in business, like taking two crappy businesses and merging them doesn't make one good business. Now you've got one really big crappy business.
That must have been really interesting, like, just to see that or be part of that. No doubt stressful going through that kind of, experience, but how interesting to see, that actual change. And was there any more, just obviously culturally, obviously there was a focus on safety. There was, obviously changing some of the leadership. Did you see anything else, like in terms of the cultural or other change shift based off that made a real impact? Or maybe that's the number one. Obviously, that's the number one thing.
Yeah, I mean, so it's how that trickles down through the organization, right? So the point about EHS first was every meeting you had, every presentation you did, historically, if you were doing your quarterly results, you'd say, right, we made this much money and we've got extra market share. With the HFS, all our presentations, all the reporting started with the health and safety thing, right? So you're forcing everybody to behave differently. So if you just say, "Oh, safety is important for us," safety is important, blah 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 blah, and we did things like, if anyone did get killed, we'd lower the flag to half-mast globally. But forcing people to change everything they do, right, is much more dramatic, because lowering the flag, you've done it, you walk away, it's done, right? And we all see the flag and go, "Oh, that's sad, somebody's died." When you change it so that everything has to start, all your meetings have to start with this thing, it really does force change into people. And so everybody is aware we're not going to get onto the finances until we've done the health and safety stuff. So when you're trying to change how people behave, physically changing how they behave is part of that, right? So yes, we'd instruct people how to behave more safely. It doesn't sound very funny, but I have a funny story I'll come back to in a minute. You're telling people to behave more safely, but then how do you know if they're actually doing it? Well, you make them talk about it. And you don't let them talk about anything else until they've talked about this.
Interesting. So part of that is really driving it home in almost every meeting, like ground level, day to day, or week to week, whatever the report, whatever the cycles are, but just making that front and center, probably a couple of key questions. And I'm presuming that even with that, there's the reporting that comes with that, right? And it's like, yeah, let's see our safety report, and let's talk about our safety report and how are we doing on that. And so probably it sounds like even obviously a big shift in culture and thinking, but then bringing it down to the execution level. It's actually done in the meetings and like right at ground level there, hey? And probably the reporting and maybe KPI. I'm not, I guess KPIs obviously, as we know, help either monitor some of those things. And then these are the non-financial, safety KPIs, I guess, to some extent, that people can, change their behavior based off, hey, we're tracking this now. This is really important. But let's talk about how we're going to make it happen.
Yeah, and introducing a database of these health and safety things. So we collect an awful lot of information about finance things. And because we're in the commodity business, we also collected some non-finance things already. So we collected information about the number of tons of bauxite that we were digging up, the number of tons of alumina we produced, tons of aluminium that we were creating. So we'd have those non-finance things, but introducing a database of health and safety also then meant, someone's in charge of a database of health and safety. You're increasing the transparency around things. One of the things they discovered is like sometimes a problem was happening in one factory and they'd fix it in one factory, but it would happen again in another factory because we weren't sharing that knowledge, right? So by changing this focus, changing the way we talked about things, it also increased transparency around operations, around how different parts of the company was operating. And then you start to look and compare and see who's doing better, who's doing worse, like, what your cost per ton is in different places. So it's a sort of virtuous cycle where, because we're reporting and being more transparent about health and safety things, we're also being more transparent about everything we do. And so forcing people to be transparent, then also, again, it changes your mindset. Instead of being in your silo and instead of trying to hide mistakes, you're forcing people to talk about your mistake. Maybe mistake is the wrong word to use because we we don't want it to sound pejorative, but if there's a piece of equipment that failed in one factory, you have to tell every other factory, otherwise your health and safety numbers aren't going to look good, right? And then that forces people to be honest about failure, whether that failure is internal or external, right?
This is an interesting one because as you start to shine a light on KPIs or just the transparency of information, and people are ultimately feeling probably more accountable, right? Can be a scary word for some people. How did you find, like with the company, did you see a lot of like when this started to transpire, did you see a lot of turnover? Was there, or more people getting on board? I mean, what did that transition look like from an organizational change? People, they
There was a lot of transition. So I pretty much every top level job changed, and at least one layer below that, pretty much everyone changed, which didn't necessarily mean there was external people, but certainly the CFO was external, and the new controller was external. And in some parts of the business, it was internal promotions. But that sends a really good message to people as well. Like if you want to signal a change, like there's no better signal than seeing the top guys fired, or decide to spend more time with their families. So that's part of the signal. And then one of the things when we bought Passionate, I remember talking to some of the senior managers afterwards, and they were really surprised because Travis Engen had done this presentation saying, post acquisition, we're going to look at the best people for the job, whatever that job is, wherever that job is, whether you're a former Alcan person, a former Passionate person, a former Aliswiss person. This is new Alcan. We're going to look at the best people. And I remember a couple of them saying they were really surprised because that wasn't the culture within their business experience in France. Was I'm at risk of getting nasty emails from my French friends, but like the culture in France is like you appoint your buddies from either from your haute école, your university, or your polytechnic, or buddies that are connected to senior civil servants or senior politicians, right? And so there was this sort of cozy arrangement, and outsiders were not allowed in. And Alcan had this merit-based program where they said, right, we're going to put this person in charge of this business. So some of the executives from Passionate were appointed to the top position in the new Alcan. And that also sent a message to people, right? It sent a message to all the people coming in from Passionate, like there's good opportunities, so don't leave just because you think we're going to turn on you. But also a message for the Alcan people, like don't assume that because the company's doing well, you're automatically going to get free money, right? Everyone has to earn their way. And so there's quite a few people who, as I say, were retained from the Passionate side, and that was a great way of sending out a message of change. That the new company was not a slightly bigger version of the old company. And again, on the aphorism side, there's that saying that you can only tell quality by its absence. So a real difference between that experience with Passionate and when Rio Tinto bought Alcan. I remember being in a meeting where one of the Rio Tinto people said, you have to remember that you're not at Alcan anymore. We're in charge. I thought, but we? Why are you we?
Yeah.
And I'm you. It was very strange, but that was the mentality in that takeover, was that Rio Tinto felt it had bought Alcan and therefore it owned Alcan. It wasn't a bigger Rio Tinto. It wasn't a better Rio Tinto. Rio Tinto had this thing on the side, and their mentality and their culture was not very inclusive, not very productive, I don't think. So a real contrast, and you kind of get used to being in a good company, and then you end up in a bad company, and you go, oh, that wasn't normal. It wasn't normal to be in a high performing business. It wasn't normal to be that successful.
It's interesting, Rio Tinto, that brings back some memories, actually. I worked at Accenture for a small period of time. And one of the things that we were getting into was actually KPIs on working with the finance operations and understanding all the KPIs that matter. And there was this massive list of KPIs and so many KPIs with a tree that went like 7 levels deep to really understand. And and I remember thinking like that's just too much, some of it was just too much, right?
Yeah.
And so that's probably a bit of a segue into like the next, just around, your perspective on like data-driven decision making and how much data is out there and just KPIs and maybe understanding, your perspective on, where you see things going with data decision making and all the data out there and just a perspective.
Yeah. So when I got brought to Montreal, so it was partly to finish the work I'd started with the Alice Swiss acquisition and the synergies programs, and the other part of it was changing the way we did budgeting. So I guess like a lot of companies up to that point, sort of budgeting was an accounting process, right? So all the accountants around the world would send in a budget that was essentially in the format that we did our accounting. But accounting is done in a format that's for compliance with GAAP. It's in a format that's for compliance with financial reporting standards and what the auditors or the SEC expects to see. But your budget is supposed to be there for your management team, right? And you don't publish your budget. So why were you collecting it in a way that looked like a published document? And part of the reason is when accountants are in charge of things, we like to do things properly, with controls in place. And one of the controls we have is we like to compare actuals against budget, right? And we sort of say, is that okay? But particularly in commodities businesses, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you leave the accountants to gather data and manage the data, we end up turning everything into an accounting exercise. But budgets are supposed to be a management exercise. So we changed that, and we initially thought we'd try and find a way to do that accounting exercise more efficiently. Nothing against Hyperion, but like because we used Hyperion for our consolidation system, we would bring in all this data, and if you didn't bring in all the data into Hyperion, it would fill in the gaps.
I remember that. I remember those days. Yeah.
Right. So, you'd end up with sort of really weird looking numbers in your budgets because you had to do it with the same rigor as you would do your monthly accounting. Well, that's not what the plan is about, right? So initially we thought we'll do that in a system that was at that time called a datum. Then Cognos bought it, and then IBM bought Cognos. Yeah. You've been in the business too long, Lance. You know all these.
Cognos planning, a date and Cognos planning. That was
Yeah.
Continue on connecting dots. So that's all.
Yeah, no, it was an exciting tool. Like it was good fun. It was an interesting project. But then we realized like we're still doing the wrong thing. So we're doing the wrong thing a better way, but it's still the wrong thing. And actually we managed to change, and part of the idea was also we wanted to move from an annual budget to a 6-quarter forecast. And part of that is, again, accountants, we like to talk about an annual budget because we do annual financial statements. But the business doesn't start on the 1st of January and stop on the 31st of December, particularly in smelters. Like they are running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's no start and stop. So when you put in these things, and you have to for legal reasons, tax reasons, whatever, But that's not how the business operates. So we said, right, let's do a 6-quarter forecast. We'll try and get people to stop racing towards the year end. Because that's the other thing. And I remember that particularly I mentioned earlier, I did the audit of Surrey County Council. When I was at KPMG, we did an audit of Surrey County Council. And it's like 30% of their costs were in the last month of the year. Because people would look at their budgets and go, oh, geez, I didn't spend my budget. If I don't spend it, I'll lose it and I won't have it next year.
Yeah.
Buy 10 million pencils or whatever it was. Right? Just go out there and spend the budget. So we're trying to get people away from that idea of racing towards the year end. Like, that's not, again, it's not what our customers want. It's not what our investors want. Like, they want a longer mindset. So we're moving to a 6-quarter rolling forecast so that we're constantly, moving out 18 months instead of racing towards that shortened year-end period where we've got to spend the money or make the profit. Didn't always work brilliantly. Like at one point, we still got into that thing of racing towards the year end because we'd made a commitment to the public about how much free cash flow we were going to generate, and it didn't look good. So like everyone was focused on trying to get that, and it was dumb. Like our customers were confused, our suppliers were confused. Like, why are you sending me this different message in December?
Why are you not paying me? Wow.
Yeah, exactly.
Why are you trying to pay me in? Like I'll pay you at the end of the month.
Yeah, why are you not paying me? And then
yeah,
our customers as well. Like we'd offer them discounts to pay early, and then they said, "Well, if you can afford a discount, let's maintain a lower price throughout the year." No. So we made that mistake once, and then we didn't do it again. But we ended up getting away from that data collection exercise, and we really cut it down. We said, look, whatever you have to do locally, in some places you have to do a budget, right? Because the tax authorities expect you to pay your profit tax in installments during the year. So you have to project how much profit you think you're going to make, and then you pay your tax on it, and then you find out whether you made that profit and true up your tax figure. So some places locally you had to do that, but globally we didn't have to. And so globally we said, look, don't do that. We don't need to collect all this data. And we got it down to like, I don't know, 25 numbers. So instead of doing the entire chart of accounts, all the way through every budget center, every cost center, every profit center, we just said, let's collect up these much smaller set of numbers. And it turns out keeping it really simple and agile, I don't mean agile in the technical sense, but keeping it simple but easily adjusted, was probably more accurate than collecting loads of data, but having it be kind of stuck in Hyperion, where we couldn't flex for changes in foreign exchange, we couldn't flex for changes in oil price, we couldn't flex for changes in the aluminium price. And if you're an aluminium business and you're the second biggest aluminium business in the world, and you can't flex for changes in the price of your commodity, it's problematic. Right? So by simplifying it, really simplifying it, getting it right down to like, what are the key things that are really going to drive all this, and then adding on this ability to flex the numbers, we found we were every bit as accurate or more accurate than when we had this giant data sucking exercise.
it's interesting, and again, it probably, and then the focus on that drove probably some different decision making as well, right? Not having to wait for such a long period of time. So I guess the agile component to that was being able to, drive new actions in quarter, as opposed to waiting, to the budget to make sure we're hitting our numbers. There was a very clear focus on some of the actions. I mean, that's what I mean, that aspect is what I love about business. And it's funny, I have the experience where same thing. I worked for a large company called Logica CMG in the UK, big outsourcing, and we would collect using Hyperion lots of information, management reporting. I want to say by every division, we probably had like 50 reports, and some of the reports were detailed project analysis, like 100 pages long. And one report I missed because I was the one checking and reviewing and putting the PowerPoints together and everything. And one of the COOs of the division put a big block of text saying, "Does anyone read this?" And I got sent up the chain to, group and, all the other finance executives. And for 2 months, it didn't get noticed until the new CEO that came on board, read it. And man, did he, I mean, first and foremost, he's like, what a waste of time.
Yeah.
And cut it back to 5 pages.
Yeah.
That's all we needed, was just to keep clarity and kind of focus, right? And
very, very familiar story. When we used to produce a budget book, and it was, I guess, a centimeter thick. And it took a long time to produce, and then we had to send it to our printing department, because we had a printing department in the good old days when stuff was done, physically. And they had this, thick book, and we didn't ask for permission. We just stopped producing it.
yeah.
We said, let's see if anyone notices. And it used to go out to the presidents of each of the divisions. We had 6 divisions. The president, the CFO of each division, and then the corporate C-suite all got a copy of this budget book. And out of the 20 or so people who used to receive that book, one person asked where it was. And we said, well, actually, we're experimenting to see if people read it. So, if you want it, we'll send it. He's like, no, I'm very happy to support your initiative. I didn't want to see it. I just knew I hadn't got it. And I don't know, over the years, how maybe in the past it had been useful. But amazing to me, all these, these C-suite people, like you say, like we thought we were producing something for them. Like they didn't care. They genuinely didn't care.
Yeah. And
they're running their own thing.
Yeah. And coming back to your story, just how you moved from like quarterly forecast, I remember an experience again in the FP&A as FP&A manager for this company. And our monthly review was, hey, let's look at actual versus budget. And we did this every month, and the budget number never changed. And the variance to the budget was just like, guys, it's the same thing I said last month and the month before that. I'm just not going to talk about it anymore, but I'll write it so that you guys can see it.
Yeah.
And when I went through that, I was like, this is not right. Like this is a waste of time. Like I'm sitting with the sale, the VP of sales, the VP of ops, and we're talking about this. And like, this isn't the conversation we should be having. So like, I just obviously created a good kind of forecasting model, simplified it. And then it was all about forecast. And then it got interesting. The conversations I thought were just like, oh yeah, that's coming through the pipeline and that for resourcing. And the dialogue changed by looking at quarter on quarter or focusing on a forecast, which was actually a little more real. But the thing was, you just needed to make it simple and not a burden on the organization. And I think that's where company, through doing this massive data collection, like the perception of that exercise is just like, oh my God, it's budget season. Please no, right? and us as management accountants and FP&A folks, it's like we want to make it easy. This should be what drives the business forward, the strategy forward, right? And
we would start. I think we would start in like June.
Mm-hmm.
So it was calendar year was the financial year, and we'd start the budget process in June. Right, we'd send out the assumptions. Well, 6 months. That particularly in commodities business, things change pretty quickly. So like I know there's a war in Ukraine. All of a sudden, the commodities shoot up in price, right? So we'd start this process in June, and then by September we'd have to reissue the assumptions because something had changed, and then this would sort of it would roll up and cascade up into this global number, which would go to the CEO. He'd make adjustments, cascade that back down, cascade it back up. It would get to the board. The board would go, "Oh, that's not what we were expecting." It would cascade back down and cascade back up, and it was 6 months of fiddling with numbers. And then we realized like everyone was gaming the system. So, well, not everyone. There was one division that didn't game the system, and they suffered as a result. But the smarter guys, I'd say smarter, perhaps not very honest, but like smarter but not honest, would put in a budget in September that was at about 90% of what they thought they could do. Because they knew it was going to get sent back. If they put it in at 100%, it'd get sent back. If they put it at 80%, it'd be sent back. Unless they did it at 120%, it would get sent back. So they'd put in 90%, it would get sent back. This is rubbish. They'd add in a few more, it would get sent back, and then they would get it to like where they really thought they could be. And they were obviously gaming the system because their bonuses were partly based on their budgets. Right. So the bonus was not based on the outcome, it was based on the budget. And this one division, they would always put in an honest answer first time around. And then they'd be told, "Hey, everyone else has just increased by 5%. You need to increase by 5%. They're like, "But where? How would we do this?" And the other divisions were like laughing behind their hands, right? Going,
Yeah.
"You guys are fools. Like, you're never honest on your first thing." So when it came to bonus season, if you hit 100% of your budget, you got your bonus. And if you did better than budget, you got a bigger bonus. These poor guys in this one division, they never got 100% of their bonus because they were always being given a stretched target.
Yeah.
But the guys in these other divisions, they never had a stretched target. They always got 100%. And at one point, we did some analysis on this, and we said, look, either this one division is really, really bad, and we know it isn't, or there's something wrong with this process. And of course, the other problem with that is like shareholders don't care what your budget is, right? If I buy your shares thinking I'm going to get a 10% return, I want a 10% return.
Mm-hmm.
And if you put in a crappy budget that's only going to deliver 8%, you shouldn't get a bonus because you didn't deliver 10%, which is what the shareholders want. When you have your bonus based on an internal target that, generally speaking, you don't share with your investors, there's this disconnect between what your investors want and what your employees are trying to achieve. And so, the CEO is out there saying, yeah, we're gonna value maximize, we're gonna double the value of the business within the next 5 years. And then they go, well, you're not doing that, but everyone's still getting a bonus.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's this, gaming going on where people get free money.
And it's interesting. I've always had this thought, and I'm like, well, why do they still do a budget? And I think it is because it's tied to incentives or bonuses, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know if you've seen anywhere where they've had, it's not just budget, but maybe on a more of a forecast or a different incentive model. I mean, I know there's share options, obviously, things like which have some of that, but I feel that's what I feel is the budget. The reasons budgets still exist is for that very reason. Is yes, we want to do targets and yes, but I think it's more bonus related, and like it's like why are organizations not moving more towards that rolling forecast? I mean, I think they are now. Now it's like a lot of organizations, if they're not getting onto a rolling forecast, I think are, not as competitive. Personal opinion.
So when I joined, I think they already had it in place when I joined, but at one point, Alcam was using a thing called EVA, earned value added. if you remember those days, by Stern Stewart. And the idea was, because obviously if you've got some old assets and some new assets, when you're looking at your return on capital, the old assets seem to be really great assets because they've been completely written down, but they make a profit. So you've got no capital invested apparently, but you're making money. You buy a new bit of kit, it costs you $1 billion. It's not making anything like the return that the old stuff did. So it actually puts you off investing in new capital. But if you get put off investing in new capital, you don't have a sustainable business. So the idea with EVA was that you had this almost like a shadow set of books, which maintained the value of your old assets so that you could see if it's generating a return. Right?
Yeah.
And then there were various adjustments that you had to put through. So you'd take out you could take out things that are outside of your control. So if there was a change in customs duties or something, you could take that out, because it was really trying to measure what your actual performance as a management team was. But I remember hearing one of the folks from Stern Stewart saying that he had lost a lot of business when he said there should be a memory built into the system of bad years. So if your EVA target was 10%, and one year you made 9%, his proposal was next year you've got to make 11. Well, it's not exactly 11, right? But you get the idea.
Yeah.
So if there's a year where there's like economic distress, you don't get to sell a bunch of stuff, you make no money. That year you don't get your bonus, right? But you shouldn't get it the next year until you've made up the losses from the previous year. So as soon as I started proposing that to management stopped taking my phone calls. Because the whole point was to try and focus your business on actually achieving things for your customer, for your investors.
Yeah.
And budgets don't do that. And there's no long-term incentive to investing if it gets you a lower return than using crappy old equipment. And and he was really, like, he was genuinely, this was his real passion, right? It was like doing better for shareholders and other investors. But yeah, like as soon as he started saying, management are going to be held to account for losses, and until they make up those losses, they don't get a bonus, he became very unpopular.
Yeah, I'm sure the mob was out, and I remember that. Yeah, that economic value added, and I think, I always thought that was a pretty, in theory, right, a pretty good approach, kind of looking at that. But in practice, there's the practice, right? It's like didn't really align with the organization or the behaviors.
I think also, I mean, if you look at something like Tesla, I can't remember what it is, but obviously last week they had sort of pretty disastrous results. But like, at one point, Tesla market valuation was something like 60 times EBITDA. Well, no other business is being valued at 60 times EBITDA, right? So in that circumstance, EVA makes no sense, right? Because whatever's going on with the shareholders, it's got nothing to do with earned value, right? They've got other things in their minds. And so if you are producing EVA numbers, it's completely irrelevant to shareholders doing that. And I think some of the other businesses, modern businesses, you can look at things and go like, would that make sense if you're investing in a company that's focused on AI, right? You're not looking at historic performance. You're not even looking at current performance. You're really focused on where you think this giant shift in the economy is going to take you.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're collecting all this lovely data about how much money you've spent on servers and how much money you're generating from paying customers, you'd look at it and go, this is a terrible business.
Mm.
You don't want to invest in this business. They've spent a fortune. They're blowing cash. Absolutely terrible. But then you're ignoring the fact that this is going to be, the next industrial revolution, theoretically, potentially. And so, you want to be invested in this, because if you miss out now, you're going to be regretting it in 5 years' time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I do. If someone had objected to EVA because of that, I go, okay, fair enough. But if you're objecting because you're not getting your bonus, that's a terrible.
I wanted to, well, not switch gears, but just, I know when we talked before, you've had some experience, obviously, working for extensive experience for-profit companies and then non-for-profit, sitting on boards. And I think you provided an interesting perspective just around, obviously, the difference between, KPIs and things that matter. And we know investors are all about money, nonprofit is obviously not. But you gave an interesting perspective on, how you start to look at, for-profit companies a little differently based off your experience in nonprofits. And maybe you can elaborate on that, because it was really interesting, your new perspective on KPIs and some of the non-financial metrics that were.
But the biggest and most obvious difference between the for-profit companies, particularly the ones I've been talking about, like mining companies, have tens of billions of dollars in capital, and they have access to markets, and they've got physical goods that they can use as security if they're borrowing money. Not for profit, you don't have access to capital, not in that same way, right? If you're working in a charity, chances are, if you're an old established charity, you might have a building that you operate out of, but you don't have access to a lot of capital. It's difficult to raise money. And anyway, banks don't like lending to charities. Like that's not their thing. So your resources are completely different in a not-for-profit, and that's kind of obvious. But what I've seen over the years is the access to volunteer resources. So you and I have both volunteered for the same organization, Chartered Institute Management Accountants, and we bring to that a lot of valuable knowledge and experience and time. But one of the things that I had revealed to me at a charity that I was on the board of is that the new CEO that we appointed, he's made this big change in the culture within the organization of saying our volunteers are workers. And previously, there's sort of, up to that point, had been a kind of approach that volunteers are they're not workers. They are not as competent, they're not as professional, they're not as important as employees, because employees are the really, they're the smart guys because they're getting paid for this work, and you're an idiot because you're doing it for free. And he said, no, everyone who's doing work is doing work, and some of those people are getting paid, and some of those people are not getting paid, but they're all important, and we can't achieve our purpose without it. And so some of that focus within the business and the culture within the business then changes, because you see your employees in a different light, that they're not the purpose of the organization, right? And they're not the only way the organization succeeds. And these volunteers are a huge part of it. And the volunteers are almost like a substitute for the capital that a for-profit company can bring in. The volunteers bring in this HR capital, as it were, and it really changes your understanding of what is important within those businesses and how you are maintaining the interests of those people, how are you rewarding those people, how you keep those people motivated. And you don't have the same sort of tools that you'd have for an employee. You can't give them pay raises, you can't give them a promotion, you can give them other awards, right? You can give them volunteer of the month, whatever. But it's a very different experience, and then that helps change the way you think about people and what people contribute. And I hadn't mentioned this earlier, but I do remember there was a TV program back in the day called Back to the Shop Floor. There was a similar version in North America, but I think the UK, I think it was called Back to the Shop Floor. And there was the CEO of a business, I think it was Rent a Kill, was being shown how to find and trap rats. So Rent a Kill was a rodent, amongst other businesses. They had a rodent elimination business. And the CEO was working with this professional rat trapper. And this guy knew everything about rats. But he was also brilliant with customers. Because when the customers phone you, yes, they want you to get rid of the rat that's in their kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
But they actually want more than that. They're looking to you for comfort, that their house is safe. They're looking to you for comfort that their baby isn't going to have its nose nibbled by a rodent, right? And so you're not selling rat catching, you're selling happiness, and you're selling, confidence that your home is safe, and it's a home, it's not a home for other creatures. And he was talking about this, and the guy was showing him how to catch rats, and then the CEO has to try and do it. Wasn't very good. But this guy was saying, I'm going to have to leave the company because as the rat catcher, I only get paid this amount of money, and my family is growing, and I need more money. So I'm going to leave. And the CEO then went back and he was looking at payroll systems, going, geez, the guys at corporate are getting paid this much money. The person who's actually making money for us is getting paid less. And the only way for him to get paid more is for us to take him out of that and put him in a corporate job where he could get paid more. Whatever. But that's not what our customers want. Our customers love this guy. He turns up at their house and there isn't a rat in the world who can outthink this guy. Like, he is brilliant, and he provides a very smooth service to people. He's not just catching the rats. He doesn't look like a rat catcher. You have this image of a rat catcher who's kind of a little grubby, a little weird looking. He's got a few bits missing from his face. He's got whiskers. Smells of cat. This guy is brilliant. Our business is based on this guy, but he can't earn a living in my company doing this. It's mad. And those things, like, so the stuff that the not-for-profits do, and that example that stuck in my mind for years, like, really makes me think when I'm dealing with customers and their problems, sorting out issues in their company, is like, we really have to think about, it's not about giving away free money to people just because they got themselves into an awkward financial position, right? But like, where is our revenue really coming from? What is our purpose? What is really going on in this business? And at the Humane Society, where I was volunteering, we've got to do certain things. We've got to have a president. We've got to have a CEO. We've got to have a finance team, because you've got to organize stuff. But really, what our donors want is that they want to see happy cats. They want to see healthy dogs. They want to know that, if someone comes in who can't afford vet services, that their pet gets looked after. Mm-hmm. And they don't care if it's by a volunteer or by someone who's paid money. They don't care if we've got a really good fundraising team or, we've got a really good HR structure or whatever. Like, they don't want that. What do people care about? Why does someone give money to Humane Society? Right? And you really got to think through the purpose. What are we doing? How are we doing it in terms of the purpose? Sometimes in companies, we lose sight of that. Like I say, we're worried about our bonuses. We're worried about budgets. And we lose sight of that purpose. What do our investors want? What do the customers want? And it really helps working outside of your industry, working outside of your market, seeing how other things are going in it, and it helps you readjust your expectations from colleagues and what work really means, and what we should be rewarding and how we should be rewarding it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm sure you probably take a lot of your experience, from both sides into your current company today. I'm sure. I think probably just to summarize here, Martin, I think one, it's been obviously great chatting to you. Um, is there any other advice that you give, people listening to this podcast, based off some of the culture things that we talked about in terms of M&A, or even just the topic we just had on uh, KPI, state decision making forecasting? We covered a lot. So, is there anything else you'd like to share with?
So one of the things I always talk to people about is communication, and I'd mentioned this briefly earlier, so I'm going to fit this in, and you can decide whether you leave it in the podcast or not. So when I was talking earlier about health and safety, there was a perception when I was at Alcan that we wanted the operations to be focused on health and safety, but corporate wasn't quite as focused on it. And there was a couple of incidents that happened where there was serious injuries at our HQ. We were like, how do we get serious injuries at HQ? We're not doing anything. Like, what's going on? One was a guy who was reading his BlackBerry, if you remember BlackBerries, and didn't realize there was a step, missed his step, and snapped his knee. And so, like, if that was in a factory, there'd be sort of an investigation, and there'd be communications around being careful about things. So, how come corporate isn't living up to the standard? The other one was there was a lady who was wearing sandals in the office, and she pulled the door open, and I think it was windy outside, so she really sort of yanked on this door, and instead of it coming open slowly, which it normally would, it had sort of blown right in. And because she had sandals on, it ripped the toenail off her big toe, which is just,
I know. Yeah.
makes the spine tingle, right? So the next day, the health and safety message came out going, look, you won't be allowed to wear sandals in a factory. We're not wearing sandals at head office. So you got to stop this. But because this was in Montreal, the original message was written in French and then translated to English. And this is where the communication thing comes in. It's so important. So a word for sandals in French is thong, Thong, right? So there was a ban on wearing tongs in the office. When they translated that into the English, they kept that same word because they recognized it's what we call a faux ami. They recognized that this was a word in English, thong. So the message came out saying we're now banning thongs in the office, and payroll supervisors would be required to check that employees were not wearing thongs in the office. And I saw this, and being relatively bilingual, I understood where that had come from, and I was just, okay, I see it.
Darn.
One of my team came up to me and was like, "What is this?" Because he was a Hispanic guy. I guess his French wasn't as good. He didn't recognize that it was just a simple mistake. So, what is this? Are you going to be checking if I'm wearing a thong? No, it's not happening. But then it left this idea in my head, like, why are you so worried? What are you wearing? So anyway, communications in business, especially in leadership positions, it's so important. Oh, it's kind of funny, but all the stuff that Travis did in changing the culture, it was all about communicating a new way of doing business. Whether it was communicating to the guys from FP&A that they'd have a job if they're good enough for it, regardless of where they came from, whether it was communicating around health and safety and sharing screw ups around the world, whether it was communicating about how we were supposed to deliver value to our shareholders. Everything's about communication. And accountants are pretty notorious at being bad at communicating, right? We're very good with numbers, not so much with message. So that's one thing I would sort of give as a takeaway is like, communicating, really work on it, especially as you're if you're working in up the ladder into a more senior leadership position, although we're all in leadership positions, but in a more senior leadership position, really got to work on that communication skills piece, because it's not necessarily how you get to be a qualified accountant, but it is how you get to be a CFO.
Yeah, absolutely, 100% agree. I mean, that the piece of paper that you get when you have your designation, that opens the door or opportunity potentially, but it is communications and emotional intelligence. I also think about as kind of key to being a leader and climbing the ranks. So. Well, Martin, I will say thank you for taking the time. Really enjoyed the conversation, and I will let you enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thank you for watching this episode of the Integrated Business Planning Podcast. If you have a transformational story to tell, or would like to drop some wisdom or share some insights about your experience or your journey, I'd love to have you on the podcast. So please reach out. Thank you.